When I walked into that cell designed in such conditions with zero light and complete isolation, the first few hours I would ask myself, like, how is it possible that in the 21st century we have these medieval places?
This is Felix Maradiaga, a prominent member of Nicaragua's political opposition who has devoted his life to advancing human rights in Latin America.
In February 2021, Felix announced he was running for president against strongman Daniel Ortega. 5 months later, he was arrested on charges of financing terrorism.
Felix spent 611 harrowing days in prison before being stripped of his Nicaraguan citizenship and banished to the United States with 221 other political prisoners.
Now, from Florida, where he resides with his wife and daughter, Felix is continuing his work in nonviolent resistance strategy and democracy building. I'm Casey Michelle.
And I'm Elisha Maldonado.
This is Dissidents and Dictators.
Hey, Case.
Oh, hey, Elisha, how's it going today?
It's going all right. How about you?
Oh, I'm doing fine. I had a productive weekend of baking cupcakes and then putting little pumpkins and spiderwebs on them.
Oh, what kind of cupcakes?
Chocolate cupcakes, but they now have not only spiderwebs and pumpkins, they also have edible eyeballs, which I didn't know were a thing.
It's just like sugar.
I certainly hope so. It's not real eyeball.
Oh. Did you do that by yourself?
No, I had help from a certain toddler in my life who's far more talented at cupcake decoration than I will ever be.
She's so cute. And more talented than I am because I am not a baker.
Well, look, you got to start them young, and that's what I'm hoping to do. The other thing I'm hoping to do in terms of starting her young is instilling democratic values in her so that at some point in her life, she can fight for democracy just as much as many of the other individuals and organizations that we speak with on this podcast who are incredibly inspiring.
Well, I think with a dad like you, she'll probably pull that off.
Well, it could go one of two ways. She could either succeed or fail spectacularly, and look, I'll take responsibility.
She'll still be loved either way.
For both. But again, that brings us to the gentleman we're speaking with today in terms of inspiring figures. Felix Maradiaga out of Nicaragua.
Oh, yeah, such a beautiful story. Such a beautiful human being, just in general. His wife is so lovely. It's just a beautiful family.
Fantastic
Very
husband,
kind people.
fantastic father, but most especially fantastic democracy activist in Nicaragua and frankly globally at this point.
Yeah.
And we had a fantastic conversation with him today.
Yeah, you'll hear in the episode in which he says that he's not a hero, and he certainly is, I think, and keeping up the good fight, as they say, not just for Nicaraguans, but for people around the globe.
Well, not all heroes wear capes, but Felix is certainly one of them.
Your favorite does wear a cape, but
That's exactly right.
Batman, that is. All right, well, let's get to the episode, shall we?
Absolutely.
All right. If we can start with your upbringing, how you were raised in Nicaragua. We always talk about here in the human rights world that no one really wakes up and decides, I'm going to become a political prisoner, or I'm going to become a political dissident. These things are sort of entrenched in the way, you grow up. Can you talk about your upbringing and the first time you left your country as a 12-year-old on foot, and kind of give us that background?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to talk with you. And you're absolutely right. When someone decides to make this a journey, because I wouldn't define this exactly as a career, indeed, nobody thinks, I'm going to be a dissident or a freedom fighter or a human rights defender. But in my particular case, injustice was around me as an early age. I grew up in northern Nicaragua. I'm on two very well-known towns, Matagalpa and Jinotega, and they're well known because these towns have been the theater of many civil wars in the northern part of the country. Beautiful. You can get the best coffee in the world. Believe me, the people is so loving. But for some reason, my country has been the theater of invasions, political and military occupation, civil wars. And my father, for example, had been a student in Chile in the early 1970s under a scholarship. He was never a politician, just someone that wanted to study law, and Chile at the time became very attractive. But there was a coup d'etat in Chile. And my father, as many other foreign students, got caught up in the political mess, so he decided to go back to Nicaragua. And the military regime of Nicaragua at the time, this was 1972, 1973, was very close to the military regime that had conducted a coup in Chile. So my father was mistaken by a political activist and was sent into prison in a number of occasions as a political prisoner, and he was tortured. Many years later, in the early 1980s, he passed away of a motorcycle accident at age 32. I was only 8 years old when my father passed away, but I grew up seeing the scars, both emotional and physical, of a victim of torture. I witnessed his suffering. He was a man of a deep faith. And my mother, on the other hand, was the victim of political persecution by the Marxist regime. So could you imagine a
Mm,
child that just couldn't understand? I mean, for me, there was no good guys.
right.
I remember the stories of my father never spoke about that, but I knew it through my mother or through my grandparents. I knew that political extremism, political violence was bad. So at age 12, when the war in Nicaragua was in a very dangerous situation, some of my cousins had been brought into the war by both factions. So I had cousins fighting for the Sandinista Marxists and cousins fighting for the Contras, who were backed up by the CIA and the Reagan administration. And the issue of child soldiers was very common. So my mother made the most difficult decision she could make. She said, I'd rather have you live this community. So I came to the US at age 12 as part of the first wave of unaccompanied minors, spent a few months at a refugee center, and then about 2 years with foster parents. And then in 1990, the civil war in Nicaragua was over. There was a peace agreement and the first democratic elections. And I came back to Nicaragua before turning 15, and
Hmm.
I became very politically conscious. So I became a very active youth activist in my local school. As someone that had been, coming back as a refugee, I immediately became active with something called the Youth Pastoral, which was a very well-known Catholic organization. At the time, I became one of the national leaders of that faith-based youth
Hmm.
movement, speaking against, the war, speaking on reconciliation. And I was only, 15. So 5 years later, at age 20, something completely, I would say, unexpected happened. I was in my senior year in college, and the new government decided to create this very big agency, the Agency of Peace Agreements. And I was appointed the national director for that National Reconciliation and Combatant Reinsertion Office. I accepted the position thinking that it was going to be an experience of only a couple of years. I ended up working for 10 years, originally with the title of Director of the Office for Peace Accords, and eventually Secretary General of the Defense Ministry in charge of disarmament. So that's the first phase of my journey.
Felix, you mentioned earlier that people don't necessarily choose lives or careers of being a dissident or even necessarily being a political activist, but it sounds like for you, not only were you surrounded by day in and day out political forces, of course, growing up in Nicaragua during the war, but it sounds like that interest really set in for you from a very young age. You're talking about being 15 as an organizer, being 20, starting from a very young age. Were there specific, and look, I know you have family, you have friends, colleagues who are on both sides of the war, but were there specific figures or ideological underpinnings for you that you found attractive, that you wanted to model your career on? Obviously, here we are speaking in 2024. You are one of, if not the faces of Nicaraguan democracy. But was that always something that was there as an element for you, or was it really just for you organizing what you thought the specific best policies were for certain communities or for the Nicaraguan people writ large?
Casey, I find that to be a fascinating question that I have not asked myself thoroughly. And I think it's a great opportunity to explore that. So, in this first phase of my life, the son of a politically persecuted person, the son of a mother, my mother Carmen is an amazing, hardworking woman, a woman of faith, and an entrepreneur. So I had the combination of both. In one side, my father, he wasn't quite an intellectual, but he was someone very consciously. So the first books that I had from my father were books about faith and politics. He was a devoted Catholic, so he was deep into liberation theology, for example. And my mother is actually a libertarian. So it was quite a combination. And when you are a teenager, you don't really know what you believe until you listen to others. So I think it was both a strong libertarian base on the importance of private property. Then, when I was in college, I was blessed to build a relationship with my grandfather, who was actually a very well read man on libertarian literature. But on the other hand, my Catholic faith, so John Paul II became a big inspiration. Of course, once in university, I developed an interest for nonviolence. So Thoreau, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. But beyond the ideological part and beyond the icons, I would say is two things. One was faith, and not faith from a religious perspective, but from a very practical faith. My family used to have we didn't have much. I would say we were middle class, but we had this kitchen that would prepare food for the local churches, for example, and it was a very practical faith in that particular regard. And seeing the devastations of wars, seeing the persecution was something that was really painful for me.
Oh, of course it was. I have no doubt that, again, that interpersonal element, right? The personal exposure, whether it's to the kinds of political leanings, schools of political thought, or, of course, what's actually taking place in Nicaragua at the time, which is what I wanted to ask you about. Felix, pulling back, zooming back, you spent a few years of your youth, as you just mentioned a moment ago, in the United States of America. But, of course, then you ended up returning to Nicaragua, getting deeply involved in Nicaraguan politics. I think a lot of folks who are listening are generally familiar with the war in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and again, the stabilization, if you'd like to call it that, in the 1990s. But it did seem like there was a period in Nicaraguan domestic political development when things were on the democratic march. Things were pushing toward democracy in and of itself. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of an overview of Nicaraguan politics in the 1990s and in the 2000s. And, of course, then we have the rise or the return of a figure like Daniel Ortega. Can you give us kind of the 10,000-foot overview of Nicaraguan politics, Nicaraguan democracy in the 1990s and the 2000s, really setting the stage for what we have seen over the last 15, 20 years at this point?
If you allow me, I'll quickly go back to 1979. So Nicaragua had experienced a 4 decades of dictatorship under the Somoza regime. So there were a number of members of the Somoza family ruling the country, but there actually were Samuel Huntington defined Somoza a modernizing dictator. This guy was very close to the U.S., brought American investment. So the country was doing well financially under a capitalist system, but we were facing the Cold War. So these were the years of the Cuban Revolution, and the Sandinista Revolution happened in 1979. 1979, and a lot of people thought that the revolution was going to be a hopeful side. I would say that my family was among the very few Nicaraguans that didn't receive the Sandinistas very happily. We felt that it was kind of a bad chapter. And in fact, we suffered the confiscation of our properties in the early 1990s. So the Sandinistas established a complete different regime, closer to the Soviet Union, closer to Cuba. And this triggered another civil war known as the Contra War of the 1980s. This war divided the country. In one side, people who believed in the West, and on the other side, the Sandinistas, which were very clearly aligned with the Soviet Union and Cuba. But in 1990, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Nicaragua experienced its first democratic elections. And in 1990, President Violeta Barrios Chamorro was elected. A lot of us who were refugees abroad came back to Nicaragua in 1990, and we had 16 years of democratic transitions. I served in those governments during the 1997 to 2006 in disarmament and reconstruction of the country and the peace building. But then in 2006, Ortega won the elections for a number of things. The biggest factor was, and we will speak about this later, big involvement of Iran, Hugo Chavez, a lot of money from Gaddafi. So he had a lot of money to basically buy people. But quite frankly, I think that a lot of Nicaraguans, and this is probably an alert to other people around the world, lost interest in defending democracy. At some point after 16 years, some people were naive enough to think that democracy was already a given. And Ortega took advantage of the divisions of the democratic forces. For example, the free market liberals fought with the conservatives, both democratic forces disagreeing on minor issues. And of course, the populism of Ortega was able to take power. Ortega took power in January 2007, and he established a dictatorship.
And it's not like Ortega was an unknown figure at this time. Of course, he was a figure going all the way back to the Civil War. He had been a political presence in Nicaragua for years, if not decades at that point. Were you surprised at the time about Ortega's return to the political scene and his political success in 2006, 2007? Were you surprised at his election in what was, by and large, a free and fair election insofar as he wasn't in power, he didn't have the power of the incumbency? Were you surprised by his return to political prominence and his rise to the presidency in that era?
I was not surprised from an analyst perspective. I had, written extensively about the dangers of Ortega. I was in a very delicate area of government because I was dealing with the reform of the army. The army was created by Ortega's brother in 1979. And as part of the peace agreements, the new democratic forces did not substitute the army for a new army. So the country kept the old Sandinista army. So in my case, I had a first seat exposure to the strength of the Sandinista party. I knew that they controlled the intelligence services, even though on the facade, people thought that we were a democracy. Ortega was the second most powerful man in the country after the president. He controlled about 40% of Congress and large parts of the military. So in my case, I felt that it was a clear and present danger. I spoke extensively. And by the way, my plans at the time, and this was 2006, was to come to the U.S. and pursue doctoral studies. So I came to the U.S. to pursue graduate school. And in the middle of my graduate studies, I went back to Nicaragua in 2006, precisely to try to help the political opposition. I was at that time 29 years old, and I went back to try to help in whatever way I could to stop Ortega from coming. A lot of my friends thought I was crazy, saying, Felix, you are studying at Harvard, you've been admitted into Yale University to do your PhD. What are you leaving all this to go back? And I said, well, I had suffered firsthand what a conflict, war, persecution, prison, through the experience of my father. And I knew almost as a physical experience, in my body, in my soul, in my flesh, what the country was about to suffer. I decided to stay in Nicaragua and to try to do whatever it took. So my way to respond was a very modest contribution, was to open a year later in 2007 an activist school. So I opened a college-accredited school on nonviolence.
I really like this back and forth that we have with painting the historical and political backdrop of Nicaragua to your story. And I think that your story is interesting and unique in that it feels, having talked to you and read some of your story, that it's a story of coming and going. You have leaving as a 12-year-old and then coming back to the States for school. But then in 2018, I believe, didn't you have to come back to the States for another year in exile? And we have 2018 and then we have, to now. Can you kind of give us that, those experiences of that exile and for whatever reason that was then and then compared to now?
I used those years to build this school, the Civil Society Leadership Institute. I helped with some think tanks. So the way to fight back, in my opinion, at that time was not through traditional political parties. I was heartbroken by the lack of capacity of political parties to stop Ortega in 2006. So I thought we're probably helping the next generation of activists. So I devoted myself to building civil society. Together with friends, we created Nicaraguan 2.0, which was the first youth movement based strictly on the ideas of nonviolence. I met Sergio Popovich in 2010, a good friend of yours, and Sergio was very instrumental in giving us kind of a blueprint of how to develop these different youth movements and other civil society movements. So in 2018, university students were completely fed up of Ortega. They went out to the streets to protest a number of policies, originally on the issues of environmental degradation. So the environmentalist movement went out to the streets, and also to protest economic reforms of the pension system. But the regime responded by shooting at the students, shooting at the people who were protesting. I was among those also protesting. And Ortega gave me too much credit for that. Basically, he went on national television and he argued that this was not an authentic protest. It was a coup d'etat designed by Felix Maradiaga, and they developed this. Uh, by they, I mean the regime. This kind of plot in which I had been working since 2009 on trying to overthrow Ortega, uh, which, by the way, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, I played a very, very minor role. It was actually an authentic protest led by students, some of them my students, but quite frankly, most people were Nicaraguans that had never been part of politics and they were fed up of Ortega. Ortega created a further crisis by killing over 350 people in 2018. I suffered two assassination attempts. One of them sent me to the hospital with some wounds. So I was not technically in exile. There was some negotiations at that time, and the international community believed that if I stayed in Nicaragua at that time, my physical presence could jeopardize the election negotiations. So under the possibility of coming for medical treatment, I came to the U.S. And spent actually most of my time traveling the world trying to explain the situation of Nicaragua. So I testify at the UN Security Council, spent time in Europe, is trying to mobilize international opinion, and announce my intentions to go back to Nicaragua. When I announced my intentions to go back, the regime issued an arrest warrant saying, if you're going to go back, we will arrest you. So I went back despite the arrest warrant in 2019.
Well, Felix, were these the charges, the arrest warrant? Was this for financing terrorism? Was that this one, or was that a later
That is
one?
exactly correct. That is exactly correct. Financing terrorism. Yes.
Yes, right. And of course, that is stemming from your supposed role in these protests, even though you had spent years and years, as you mentioned a moment ago, organizing nonviolent activism, organizing nonviolent protest to try to face down President Ortega. I'm wondering, Felix, because I want to fast forward a little bit to the early 2020s when you declare yourself for the presidency, because it seems. I mean, you've talked about arrest warrants. You have talked about multiple assassination attempts. None of these, I mean, look, for most people, we would say, okay, that's fine. I cherish my life. I would prefer to see myself to my elderly years and actually survive this and refrain from going up against a budding dictator. But you had the opposite effect. It seems like this only galvanized you to stand up to President Ortega that much further.
Well, I need to say that many Nicaraguans were not only as brave but even more. So when you see so many people that didn't have the international recognition I had. So at that time, I had already been acknowledged by. I'm not name dropping here, but just to give you context, right? I had been named by Forbes in 2015 as one of Central America's most influential, thought leaders and things of that sort. So I always recognize that, and I take this with great responsibility. I'm humbled by platforms such as this opportunity to talk to you, for example, and to many other friends around the world. I had spoken at Oslo Freedom Forum in 2019 as well, which gave me a great platform. So when you see other Nicaraguans without the same platform, being super brave, going to the streets, suffering political persecution, I felt moral obligation to be right next to them, and a lot of people at the time argued that Nicaragua doesn't have that many international advocates. We're a small country, geographically, we're a big country, spiritually, we're a small country geographically, and the world is competing with many issues. So friends, family, allies argued, you do better by keep on doing what you're doing, by, writing, books and articles and speaking. But I dropped inspiration from people like Angel Gaona, a journalist who worked with me and who was shot in the head in April 2018 for covering the news. Young people like Alvaro Conrado, a 15-year-old high school student who was delivering water to the protesters and was shot and killed. He was denied medical attention at a public hospital in Nicaragua, and his assassination was recorded on YouTube. And I can continue to give you names of so many people that were so brave. So how not to go back and be right next to them and do whatever it takes to bring Nicaragua to freedom?
Yeah. I want to talk to you about how you see Nicaragua's role in the region, particularly, the United States, but also comparative to other Latin American countries. I was talking to someone recently, and he was describing Latin America as a continent in flux all of the time, with cycles of democracy, then authoritarianism, and then a little bit of political instability, but still some democracy, and it's just always seemingly so cyclical. A, would you agree with that? B, can you expand on it if so?
I would agree. Nicaragua is a country that, as many other countries around the world, and this is a big topic in my talks and my lectures, is a highly divided society. And it's a microcosm of what we're seeing, around the world. And when those people who mean good for a country or for any society but are not able to build common ground, when you're divided, then you find populist, opportunistic autocrats that take advantage of those who are incapable of building common ground. So in Nicaragua, we have a community of entrepreneurs. Nicaragua has an incredible community of young people, intellectuals who are very well known in fact, in Latin America, we're known as the country of poets, for example. But on the other hand, we have this cancer. I don't have any other word to describe this kind of a virus of authoritarianism that now it's ingrained in the Sandinista party, but in the past it has other names, and it's been there. We have not been able to get rid of authoritarianism. When you bring China, Iran, Cuba, and Russia into the equation, things get a new proportion. So the Sandinista Party, for our listeners who do not may know this is not a well-known fact. The Sandinista Party was created in the 1960s as a revolutionary and guerrilla movement, very close to what was called the PLO at the time, and under the argument of the liberation of the Palestinian people. A lot of Sandinistas were trained on terrorism tactics in the 60s. It's a very anti-Israel, very anti-American, very anti-West movement. So now the Sandinistas are not a domestic problem. Daniel Ortega has used Nicaragua as a platform for the Russians, as a platform from Iran, and due to the fact that I, mentioned Israel, I'm not trying to be political here. I think that all of us who love human rights will really want to see the end of that conflict and a peaceful resolution. But Ortega, since the 1980s, has been a key player in supporting terrorism. I'll give you a fact that is not very well known. 1993, some of you may remember the first bombing to the Twin Towers. The FBI discovered that the guys who work on this plot used Nicaraguan passports given by Daniel Ortega in the 80s. So that's how deep Ortega's link. And this is only one of many examples I can provide of this relic of the Cold War. I don't have any other name. Che Guevara is dead, Fidel Castro is dead, but Ortega is there. He's a guy who has made his life mission to do harm to the United States. And sees any pro-democracy activists in Nicaragua, particularly those of us who are refugees in the U.S., who speak English. And I am Nicaraguan. I admire the U.S., but I am Nicaraguan, and I don't have American values. I have universal values. But Ortega argues that we are pro-American. So he has turned the persecution of the opposition as foreign agents. And that's basically what the situation that we are at this moment.
Well, speaking of Ortega's persecution, I wonder, Felix, if we could turn back to your personal story for just a moment, because it doesn't end with the assassination attempts, or it doesn't end with the running for presidency in 2021. Of course, Ortega then imprisons you and places you in not just any prison where you can see your family day in and day out and read whatever books you'd like to, but in solitary confinement, which is a form of torture, effectively. Without going into too many of the details, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that chapter in your life. This was, 611 days of solitary confinement. Can you tell us a little bit of what that period meant to you at the time, and maybe even means to you now that you've finally been freed from solitary?
Yes, well, in terms of solitary confinement, I was not in solitary confinement the totality of the 611 days. I was in totality confinement for a large period of time during the first year. And then after a few months of not only solitary confinement, but food deprivation, complete isolation of sound, which was a method of torture. So the guards were not allowed to speak to me. They were not allowed to issue any words. So the only opportunity I had to speak was during the interrogations. I was never had access to a lawyer. The only person who accepted to be a lawyer for me during the accusation in which I had to attend the first interrogations before going into prison, his name is Roger Reyes, was arrested. So my lawyer was actually taken into prison and submitted to extreme torture to the point that he lost his memory. He was out of prison and he could barely remember the name of his own daughters. So this is only an illustration of how extreme the system is. My family had to make a waiting list of as long as 3 hours to deliver my daily quota of drinking water. So inside the cell, I didn't have, drinking water. Long interrogations. When I was captured, I was beaten so bad that not even my mugshot was, taken during the first months of my arrest because of the injuries that were created during my arrest. I should say something that from the bottom of my heart. I think that nobody is prepared for that. I don't want to sound brave. I had been working with political prisoners before for many years. I had helped people like Leopoldo Lopez, for example, who became he's a great friend, a brother to me now. He's one of the leaders of the World Liberty Congress. I didn't know Leopoldo, but his lawyer called me when he had been arrested, many years before, and we launched a campaign for Leopoldo. And I'm bringing Leopoldo's name because I know that you know him very well and many of the listeners, but many, many prisoners around the world. So I had, through the organizations I was part of, the World Movement for Democracy and others, we had launched campaigns and I had long hours of conversation with families of political prisoners. However, when I walked into that cell designed in such conditions with zero light and complete isolation, the first few hours, I would ask myself, like, how is it possible that in the 21st century we have these medieval places? And there are days that you don't think you will survive. There are days in which, you simply, prayed God, in my case, or to the universe to basically stop that emotional pain. I was then brought into a cell with another gentleman, and it's an interesting story. I didn't know that the guards perceived me as resilient. So some of the prisoners who were actually trying to harm themselves, um, the guard says that they would place me with them, so I would make sure that they would not harm themselves. And that gave me purpose. Suddenly finding someone in that situation. And this brings me to a very important point. In such conditions, pain is inevitable. But when you have a purpose, the pain is bearable. And I think that in my case, the commitment of having a free Nicaragua, the commitment of helping others have been a sort of a way to help myself. It's not, I don't want to sound like a hero. I am not. But I'm just saying that the best way, in any conditions of life, you don't have to be in prison, to have a fulfilling life is when you can help others.
Well, I might disagree with you on being a hero, but that's okay. I'll say it for you. And speaking of Leopoldo, we actually talked to him on last week's podcast, and so I want to ask you a question that I asked him. Having also been a political prisoner and also having gone through solitary confinement, is also the toll that it takes on your family. And you have a gorgeous wife and a gorgeous daughter who got on stage with you at the Oslo Freedom Forum in 2023. And I'll just say this for myself, but then ask you for your feeling of it. But just watching you walk around with your young daughter, just in pockets around Oslo, how tightly she would just cling to your side, and always looking up as if to just make sure you're still there. He's still there, and she was so brave, far braver than I could be. She commanded that stage. So you have a really resilient family, seemingly as well. But maybe just your thoughts on that.
Well, that's the part that it takes time to forgive myself because this is a journey I chose. My wife, when we were, dating, always reminds me that I gave her heads up and I said, this is the life I chose, and I feel very, very embarrassed to share this publicly, but she has shared it publicly, so I have permission. I told her, you will never be number one. My cause for Nicaragua will be always be my number one cause. And I don't sure if I mean it that anymore, because I think that family needs to be a comprehensive part of what we are. And those political prisoners, those freedom fighters, human rights defenders who are most resilient is because they have family. Family becomes basically your lifeline. On the other hand, I was not quite conscious of the harm and the toll that it takes on family members, not only because our property was expropriated, everything we had built was suddenly taken back in 2018. It was during the first case on terrorism. They took away our, our bank accounts, our assets. By the way, that's why we're so big, fans of
Oh, I
Bitcoin
want to get into
today,
that. I want to get into that.
because we think it's such a powerful freedom tool. Um, but my wife was so brave by sending me support, even though I had never access to a phone call until the very last weeks of my arrest. But I didn't have any letters from her. But she will, through my sister, who was my hero. My sister went through humiliation, to be sure that every 90 days she could see me for a few minutes under the presence of a police officer. That act of heroism forced her to be in exile. So now my sister was forced into exile and to left behind. Sorry if I get emotional. I can take a lot of things, but the things that my family has suffered is it's something that makes me ask that question. So now my sister is in exile. She left behind her younger two daughters, but she cannot live in Nicaragua because she visited me in prison. She made the crime to visit me in prison, and I don't know if I would do the same. Not because of me, because of the emotional pain that my daughter went through, that my mother went through, that my sister and my wife. But on the other hand, now I have another purpose through my wife, Berta Valle, and the End Arbitrary Detention Initiative, which is a program that we run out of the University of Virginia. We are helping families of political prisoners. We have partnered with the World Liberty Congress as well. And not very much people understand that family members of political prisoners also need support.
Well, let's talk about the domestic state of things in Nicaragua for a moment, Felix. We have Ortega still in power now for almost 20 years at this point, the longest standing ruler in all of the Western Hemisphere, clinging to power, again, consolidating every lever of power underneath him, underneath his wife, and putting Nicaraguan democracy, of course, on the back foot right there. Meanwhile, you have an entire generation now of Nicaraguan youth who have grown up and know nothing but President Ortega. Of course, we saw some of those university protesters just a few years ago, and Ortega putting Nicaragua firmly within the axis of authoritarianism, close relations with Russia, with Iran, with China, of course, with Venezuela and Cuba. Where do you see things going? What gives you hope? What gives you optimism about the future of Nicaraguan democracy? Is it the fact that Ortega is clearly aging and clearly showing signs of, if not early onset dementia, then at least losing grip on some kind of reality and potentially power? Or is it something else? Is it organizational capacity? Or is it maybe even the cycle that we were talking about earlier between authoritarianism and democracy? Where are those shoots of optimism about the future of Nicaraguan democracy for you?
I think that all of the above. You've touched on in your question. I think that touches on three, at least three big topics. One, it's the question of optimism and hope. And I see hope by the peaceful resistance inside Nicaragua. Nicaragua has had over 2,000 political prisoners. That's a huge number for a country of just 7 million people. Now, unfortunately, about 18% of the population has been forced into exile. 18%. That's a huge amount of Nicaraguans. And when you look into the Nicaraguans forced into exile, these are Nicaraguans who are university professors, small farmers, indigenous leaders, leaders of the feminist movement, religious leaders. There's a big religious persecution, but people continue to resist. And in fact, one of the big things that we do in Nicaragua, we tried to keep the resistance alive. We have a new, I wouldn't say a new, but a different method that in which we're trying to avoid political prison. I insist that prison of today under this regime is not as it used to be, even in the times of Mandela, that could write, books from prison, or even in Nicaragua, 3 decades ago, we had freedom fighters in prison who wrote letters and who had at least could send their message. In Nicaragua, it's a method of complete isolation. So we don't want more political prisoners. We're doing different methods of peaceful resistance. We're also partnering with a lot of faith-based organizations, and that gives me hope that people continue to fight back. That's point number one. Point number two is I think your question on the global networks of Ortega, and that's a problem that is not unique to Nicaraguans. And I always insist to my friends of the international community that we can do a lot, but if China continues its influence in the hemisphere, and if Russia, which by the way has a base in Managua, the largest intelligence military base of Russia in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, it's in Nicaragua, just a few miles outside of the embassy of the U.S. And we need international solidarity, and that's another important point. And the third point is what to do. What can we do in addition to the peaceful resistance? And I think it's a combination of the following. Number one, dictators work together. We need to work together. The Nicaraguan cause is the same Venezuelan cause. It's the case of the freedom of Zimbabwe. It's the case of the freedom of Cuba. It's the freedom of the Ukrainian people. So we're trying to create this global ecosystem of freedom fighters, because dictators work together. We need to partner and to create international pressure to these dictators. And I think that organizations such as HRF is at the forefront of understanding that importance of building the ecosystem. Number two, we need to be better at fighting disinformation and propaganda. Now through the internet, even if we are in exile, we need to communicate with Nicaraguans inside. Even if you're a Venezuelan in exile, you need to communicate with Venezuelans inside the country, over Cubans inside the country. So the internet is a tool for freedom, but it can be a tool of disinformation. And in that third point, I am not as optimistic. I think that in the propaganda and disinformation battle, we are not doing as good as we should.
Mm-hmm. Well, Felix, I wanted to end on Bitcoin, which you already, alluded to, and something I wanted to talk to you about anyway. Because you've become such a vocal advocate for, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in particular being such a tool for economic freedom, especially among those who have, in the dissident community. You mentioned earlier about how all of your assets and things were taken from you guys. So can you talk about how that's been such a great tool for you and how you're trying to teach others to use it as well?
It has been a great tool to continue the resistance alive inside Nicaragua. It is a pilot project that was started a few years ago when Ortega, one of the first mechanisms that he implemented is something that I had been labeling, I'm sure someone came with that term before, financial repression for political control. So it's a combination of going after your property, blocking and seizing your bank accounts, blocking money transfers, and declaring your organizations, if you're a church, a university, an NGO, a foreign agent. So it's a combination of all of these methods. So Bitcoin is a tool for freedom because it allowed these organizations to have a financial lifeline and to continue to do things that are as simple as paying for the internet. In Nicaragua, if you're a dissident and you try to pay for the internet, you're gonna have to do it through a system that it's surveilled by the regime. But through Bitcoin, we can pay for internet, for example, and this is only one of the examples that I can publicly disclose without being intercepted by the regime. The second component of Bitcoin is that it allows protection of your asset and values. I mean, if you have a house, if you have a car, if you have other physical assets and you're persecuted and you need to evacuate the country rapidly, There's no way you can cross a border with these physical assets. But Bitcoin allows dissidents to evacuate their limited resources, which are fundamental when you're trying to rebuild your life in exile. So by taking away the middlemen, in this case, ministries of finance and central banks, which, by the way, in autocratic regimes are nothing but instruments of repression used by the regimes. We're not talking about the central bank of Norway or the treasury of the US. We're talking about the central bank of Nicaragua. So the regime has access to all your private information, and Bitcoin is, in addition to what I've mentioned, also a tool that provides your data, protects your data and your personal information.
Well, Felix, this has been a wonderful conversation. Just as a last question for you and for listeners, how can folks continue to support you, continue to support your organizational work, your activism, and especially Nicaraguan democracy? What can folks do?
Please care and be informed about Nicaragua. I think that just the fact of raising awareness in the middle of a world that has very other important issues. My heart is heartbroken for the Ukrainian people. I have been in Ukraine recently, and I talked to Ukrainian civilians and soldiers who were kidnapped by the Russians, and their mechanisms are like copy paste. These are the same bad guys. So if you are an informed citizen who follows these organizations and follows our news through Twitter or through social media, just by the fact that we raise awareness, we do not feel alone. So that's the first thing. Number two, pick a particular prisoner that you care in any part of the world. It doesn't have to be necessarily Nicaragua, and follow endarbitrarydetention.org. I'm putting my energy and time in that global initiative. It's not only of Nicaragua. We have a lot of emphasis on Nicaragua, but it's from around the world. And one of the things I want to do is to develop a new international treaty that will make it harder for dictators to pursue and arrest political dissidents and human rights defenders. We believe that this is a very innovative initiative. We're trying to have people sign in. So there's a petition you can sign of endarbitrarydetention.org.
Wonderful. Felix, this has been a fantastic conversation. We cannot thank you enough for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you again very soon.
It's been a real privilege.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Of course.
Thanks, Felix.
Thanks for joining us for today's conversation with Felix Maradiaga.
Next week, we're talking to Mark Simon about press freedom in Asia.
We hope you'll join us.
This episode is produced by Omar Al-Fatihi and edited by Talia Edgar Chalker. Our intern is Sage Gibson.
Dissidents and Dictators is a production of the Human Rights Foundation, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes and protects human rights globally with a focus on closed societies. We promote freedom where it's most at risk, in countries ruled by authoritarian regimes.